Good morning, everybody. It's my honor to introduce the session, World Anthropologies, Global Epidemics, and Imaginative Collaborations. This is a session co-sponsored by the Committee for World Anthropologies and the World Council of Anthropological Associations. Can I have the slides, please? Oh, good. They're there already. Thank you. The AAA has been engaged in an effort to acknowledge the diversity of anthropological practices that go on around the world. And the WCAA is an organization with the mission of bringing together the different anthropological associations. So we both thought it was the time that we move ahead in our mission and not only learn from one another's experiences as anthropologists doing anthropology, period, but engage in specific fields. So today we're having a round table on global epidemics. We are a few of the many anthropologists that are in the front of global epidemics that are expressed locally. And the presenters today have been engaged in the Ebola epidemic, like Sharon, who's going to speak first, in HIV, like Isaac Nyamongo, in syphilis and Zika, like Sergio Carrara, and in chikungunya, like Karen Jensen. They faced in their different settings the way local actors interact and create novel and precisely unique experiences of combating and dealing with epidemics. So the questions we are going to address today is, what can we learn from local experiences in epidemics? What can we as anthropologists engage in the front of public health and in the front of epidemics bring in, and what added value does the World Anthropologies movement brings in order to give some feedback to the global health front. We know that different local cultures of collaboration between social and health researchers, there are different national politics about gathering and sharing evidence. There are different politics of quarantine and addressing human rights or not addressing them. And we can learn from local experiences in order to go a step beyond in our anthropological work and in our mission to promote a better world. So the question I leave to the speakers is, what imaginative collaborations can improve our ability to face current and unforeseen health challenges? I wish you a fantastic discussion. I left you already with the keys to address the things, and we'll go back to these questions after discussion. This is a round table. It's not very round, but it will go around, and we'll have the 4 cases, and then we'll go back to each of them and take questions from the audience. Thank you. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Sharon Abramovitz. Sharon is an anthropologist at Rutgers University and was responsible for the task force of the American Anthropological Association during the Ebola crisis. Sharon, can you join us? Thank you. And you are here.
There we go. Perfect. Okay. Right here. I got it. So it's a pleasure to be here at this table with these people discussing this on this very rainy morning. My task here today is to perhaps be a bit of a provocateur, right? And to raise some of the issues that we've been confronting as anthropologists, engaging in global health humanitarian response around epidemics, but perhaps not addressing specifically the anthropology so much as the architecture of anthropology and how it does or does not intersect with the structure of epidemic response and humanitarian response, which in some places rather overlap and in some places are quite different. My experience comes out of having been the accidental coordinator or task force leader of the Emergency Ebola Anthropology Initiative from 2014 to late 2015 for the West African Ebola outbreak. I can tell you a little bit about my own personal story. My involvement in that role was entirely accidental because what was transpiring during the period of January 2014 and September 2014 was the almost accidental escalation of an epidemic that really could have been contained quite early on had there been a more sophisticated socio-cultural understanding of the dynamics of the region. And so what was taking place by 2009 as mortality was increasing at an exponential rate in cities like Monrovia, Liberia, was anthropologists around the world were really in a state of horror and shock at the failure of global health and the humanitarian response, particularly in the forms of WHO, CDC, USAID, and DFID, to recognize the nature of the problem that they were confronting from a systems level, from an infectious disease level, and from a sociocultural level in the region that seems so apparent to us. Another important aspect of our frustration at that time was the fact that anthropologists had almost no access to key decision makers and positions of authority. There were, at the time, these extraordinary email threads with 1,000 email recipients trying to communicate information about the dynamics of the epidemic. And anthropologists were very much on the outside of those internal and quite chaotic networks. There was no pathway for penetrating into these institutions in order to take an active, proactive, leading, early role in an emerging crisis. As a result, I lost my temper, and I called up the AAA, and I said, why aren't we doing anything? And they said, well, we had a webinar. And I said, well, that's insufficient, and I called a few other people, and I said, why isn't anything happening? And they said, well, we've been invited to speak on some panels. And this is sort of a customary way in which we engage with responses. We speak about them in other venues, right? And that's, I have to say, I believe entirely insufficient. Our voices do not carry from a panel at University of North Carolina or Harvard or the London School necessarily into the coordinating offices in the region, and that is a problem, right? That phone call to the AAA was associated with an email and a phone call to the Wenner-Gren Foundation, which is a key sponsor of international anthropological associations. And Wenner-Gren said, well, this isn't really within our scope, but why don't you give us a call and we'll see what we can do. And with the support of the AAA and the Wenner-Gren Foundation, we managed to put into place a core network of anthropologists who ultimately met in Washington, D.C., had a public forum, and issued a set of rather concise recommendations for all different aspects of the response and how the humanitarian and epidemic response might improve by taking into account these various sociocultural factors. I want to say that there were several parallel efforts taking place at the time. And excuse me while I move my slide, okay? What we, are the slides up? Thank you. It doesn't seem to be moving. Sorry. Nothing's happening up there. We have a technological issue. In any case, there were three parallel networks that emerged within a several-month period of each other. One was called the Ebola Response Anthropology Network, which was funded by DFID and was implemented through a joint venture of the Institute for Development Studies and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. That was tied to the SAGE Scientific Advisory Committee on Ebola Response. And a concerted decision was made fairly early in the response, around April or May of 2014, to give parity between qualitative and quantitative data for the duration of the response. And as a result, financial resources, institutional resources, and coordination mechanisms were put into place in order to ensure that anthropologists were at the table advising DFID on almost every aspect of the response from beginning to end. This was significant, okay? In contrast, there was a loose coalition that was initially founded in part by Marianne Fermé and Paul Richards of largely Francophone-speaking anthropologists who aggregated together under a network called the Réseau SHS Ebola. And this was intended to be a Francophone-wide network of information and collaboration about what was taking place in predominantly Francophone countries, which included one of the most affected countries, Guinea, but also included a number of surrounding countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Burkina Faso, Senegal, et cetera. Okay? And it was intended to enable anthropologists to build capacity within local academic institutions for prevention of the spread of the outbreak, mostly, I have to say, to non-affected countries thus far, okay? And then finally, there was our own network, the Ebola Anthropology Initiative, which frankly was initially little more than a listserv, right? And what we found was that by keeping the structure of the Ebola Anthropology Initiative open and flexible and allowing people to kind of come on or exit as they could, making contributions when they wanted to, we were able to ultimately grow the size of the listserv to up to, I believe, about 350 or 370 active participants, many of whom were key leaders in the response and were watching the traffic that was taking place, even if they weren't speaking. Now, as these networks emerging, you can imagine, given sometimes the culture in anthropology, that there seemed to be initially some concern about competition. In fact, the first move that everybody made was to make a website, right? Individuals were making websites, you know, like these clusters were making websites. And then we decided very, very early on that the nature of the emergency was too important for us to stake out institutional boundaries around these issues. And that instead what we would do is we would function in a task-based set of collaborations. So the Ebola Anthropology Initiative effectively functioned as a mass communications mechanism. The Ebola Response Anthropology Platform functioned essentially as a storehouse and archive of data, which in partnership with the anthropologists who were working around that was putting together advisory documents. The Ebola Anthropology Initiative was working in partnership with anthropologists at UNMIR and UNICEF in order to move anthropological information from outside into the response. Then the SHS Ebola Network was advocating loudly and strongly for the centrality of sociocultural factors and the way that things were unraveling, especially in Guinea and Senegal. What did we learn from this? Well, I believe that what we see in this is the template for a new model for emergency social science response to epidemics and humanitarian events. I like to call it an emergency social science response network. Great, thank you, just in time. The issue that we're running into is that somewhere along the way, we have just give me a thumbs up when I need like okay, thanks. Along the way, we have an issue as anthropologists with, especially in the United States, I think, with having lost our engagement with our government structures. And government structures are often key players in the roles of these responses. I know that this is not true in all countries, but this is especially true in the United States. And the United States, as often the largest single donor to epidemic response events, needs to have an institutionalized presence for anthropology and social sciences in humanitarian response. Now, there's some evidence that the government is aware of this, okay? And I'm trying to pull up a web page. Here it is. What this shows you is that on September 15th, 2015, President Obama issued an executive order from the White House calling for the use of behavioral science insights to better serve the American people. This executive order is very wide-sweeping, right? It mandates that all agencies of government integrate social and behavioral sciences into their practices and operations in order to advise their outcomes. Now, I can tell you that I, as an anthropologist, did not learn about this until I saw a list of executive orders on Facebook about 3 days ago. Okay? This posed a real opportunity that I think we've really missed, and I think that the future of government engagement with social and behavioral responses is very much in question. And I won't go too far into that right now. I'm sure that that's going to come up during the presentation. Here it is. I also want to point out the fact that the intervention in West Africa was very much conducted along post-colonial lines. France was responsible for Guinea, the UK was responsible for Sierra Leone, and the United States was responsible for Liberia. United States agencies, like the Office for Foreign Disaster Assistance, was responsible for providing funding across all 3 countries, but the actual responsibility for implementation ultimately very much followed governmental power structures and existing humanitarian networks. So in order to imagine a new paradigm for anthropological engagement with humanitarian response, we have to understand that because we oppose nationalism in many of its forms, and because we oppose post-colonial dynamics in many of its forms, we cannot refuse to engage with these institutions as they are under these contexts, or we will be cut out of the conversation, often to the peril of populations that would benefit from anthropologically informed policy. I want to just bring to your attention a couple more things before I sit down. I apologize, I'm having some struggle here getting to my presentation. Essentially, we've put together, the director of the AAA, Ed Lebo, and I sat down about a year ago, and we put together a proposal for a social science research network that was based on a set of specific parameters. It was based on the premise of openness, accessibility, global participation and cooperation, decentralized mobilization, having a scalable capacity, and an open access flow of data and information, right? And the structure that we've proposed, which I cannot show right now, unfortunately, is built upon the premise that having a permanent social science presence in epidemic response requires the creation of a permanent institutional capacity that can build relationships of trust with existing organizations like the World Health Organization, like the Office for Foreign Disaster Assistance, like other organizations that are tasked with regular mobilization during disaster response, and can sustain a standing capacity for mass mobilization and scaling under conditions of emergency, but also retains the capacity for doing analytical work on epidemics and emergencies in the aftermath of the emergencies themselves. And one of the big gaps that we have seen during the Ebola response is a significant underfunding of anthropological data analysis, right? Oftentimes we're looking at mass data collection activities, sometimes under the rubric of NGOs, sometimes under the rubric of the WHO, sometimes under independent actors. But what we're often lacking is sufficient financing and infrastructure to take qualitative studies of, say, 800 households that have been affected by a given epidemic outbreak and have the time, the labor, and the skills to analyze it so that we can make meaningful insights and inform in an important and constructive way future humanitarian response. Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon. This was really a good start. Can I call to the table Isaac Nyamongo? Dr. Nyamongo is a professor at Nairobi University and has worked extensively in HIV in Africa. Is also my co-chair in this session, so please. Would you like some assistance, or you? Okay, that's yours. It was open already.
Okay, it's okay. Let me see.
It's you? No, that's Jensen. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, present it, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Sharon, for that wonderful presentation. Indeed, when the network was being created, I was part of the response team from the World Council of Anthropological Associations. And I remember as WCA, we did write a response to Ebola, which can be found on our website. Yeah, as you have been told, my name is Isaac Nyamongo from the University of Nairobi, and I will be presenting a paper on HIV/AIDS in East Africa, and basically looking at the response of anthropologists in the region. Now, a couple of years ago, I was approached by the Global Health Council to be part of a team that was carrying out a study on faith-based organizations' response to HIV/AIDS epidemic. And that was a multi-country study that covered Haiti, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, India, and Thailand. The results of the survey were published in a report entitled The Faith in Action, Examining the Role of Faith-Based Organizations in Addressing HIV/AIDS. What emerged from that study was that initially the faith-based organizations viewed AIDS as a retribution from God for transgressions. And with the time, the clergy realized that gradually they were getting to bury more and more of the faithfuls in their churches. Finally, the epidemic had landed not at the doorsteps of their churches, but rather was actually inside their churches, was in their pews, and in some cases it was actually in the pulpit. So that was my initial involvement in HIV/AIDS research. Then later on, we did carry out a second study that was focusing on men who have sex with men in Kenya. This was USAID funded through the Population Council. And this particular study indeed did open the door for many studies that have been conducted in the country that focus on this key group. Now, if the reaction of the clergy was that of indifference, the rest of the system did not react any better. Among the political leaders, it was regarded as a ploy by the West to reduce the African population by discouraging unprotected sex. These initial perceptions and response had their own impact in the global response to HIV. It slowed down the response to avert epidemic, and it made it difficult to pass messages on prevention of HIV transmission. The first cases of HIV in Africa were confirmed soon after the reports emerged in the West, where cases were reported in 81, 82. And in Zambia, the first case was reported in 1985, while in Kenya, the first case was reported a year earlier. And by the mid-1990s, HIV had become an epidemic of unimaginable proportions. It had become a major cause of mortality in the country, and it had a huge demand on the healthcare system, as well as on Kenya's economic output. As expected, the public health officers were on high alert and were actively involved in the disposal of bodies, much like the response that we saw during the recent Ebola outbreak. By 1996, HIV prevalence in Kenya had reached 10.5%, but due to investments in care and management, and especially with the availability of antiretroviral therapy, that has seen a reduction to 6% in 2013, and currently it's estimated to be about 5.9%. Now, the HIV preference in Eastern, in Central and Southern Africa is generally moderate to high, and you can see that on the slide there. And in contrast, the response by governments in terms of provision of ARTs, that is antiretroviral therapy, in those regions is generally moderate to poor. So we have a situation where we have a preference that is moderate to high, but the response, particularly in the provision of ARTs, is moderate to poor. In the Eastern and Southern Africa region, the largest proportion of individuals on ART can be seen in Botswana, which has the third highest HIV preference in sub-Saharan Africa. Swaziland, with an HIV preference of 28.8%, has 67% of its adults on ART, while the other countries, you can see the proportion of adults who are on ART on the slide. Now, a review of how major regions of the world are faring in terms of provision of ART reveals that they are at different points of investing towards an HIV-free generation. And that slide there shows, the proportion of adults who are on ART vis-a-vis the HIV preference in the major regions of the world. Generally, what we see is a low HIV preference and a high proportion of adults on ART who are found in regions of Western and Central Europe and not North America, what you see over there. But the investments in sub-Saharan Africa are quite low in terms of the proportion of people globally who are on ART. And you will see that the difference when you look at you see the difference here. These are countries in Western Europe, Central Europe, the Caribbean, Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, Middle East, North Africa. They are basically, towards the left of that slide, whereas Africa is over on the right. And you have a preference of about 4.7 generally, and about 39% of the population on ART. Now, on this slide, you'll notice that Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Malawi are the leaders in the pack with, quite investment in terms of the proportion of people who are on ART. Whereas the countries that are highly burdened, Botswana, Swaziland, have a relatively, high HIV preference particularly in the sub-Saharan Africa and in the southern region of the continent. Now, the question then that begs us is, what have anthropologists done in response? And in this case, I'm going to basically talk about some of my involvement in various responses to HIV AIDS epidemic in the region. Now, in terms of cultural studies, we understand that such studies have often focused on, practices such as widow inheritance, levirate marriages, sexual cleansing after the death of the husband, and female genital mutilation or cutting. Now, widow inheritance and sexual both introduce new partners to the woman, and therefore new avenues of transmission of HIV, either from the new partner or from the woman to the new partner. And one of my colleagues, Professor Paul Nkui and Russell Bernard, have actually done a review of some of these cultural practices and how they influence the HIV/AIDS transmissions. Now, in his thought-provoking paper, Gossett discusses the perceived notion that culture acts as a barrier in the fight against AIDS in Africa. He argues that this notion is based on the long history of Western prejudices about sexuality in Africa, the focus often being on practice such as polygyny, adultery, wife exchange, circumcision, dry sex, sexual pollution, sexual cleansing, among others. Now, Gossett goes on to make the argument that a focus on these practices, on these areas, does not necessarily imply safer-sex behavior. Does imply safer-sex behavior. Thus, according to him, a fight against these practices might alienate people whose cooperation is necessary in the prevention of HIV/AIDS. I've also been involved in studies that focus on condom promotion. While abstinence and being faithful to one partner involves individual decisions, we must understand that condom use essentially must involve the two individuals. Many studies have focused on the issues such as acceptability, accessibility, and especially with casual partners, and consistent condom use with multiple partners. However, use within marriage, other than for family planning, is still problematic, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. In 2005, I was involved in investigating factors that promote consistent condom use among couples. This study that interviewed couples in Kampala, Uganda, who reported 100% consistent condom use during the previous 3 months, revealed that couples used various approaches to ensure that partners agreed to use condoms each time they had sex. For the women, this involves insisting that the partners use a condom, refusing to have sex, persuading the partner to use one, and introducing condoms as part of family planning. And this helped to reduce mistrust that might have developed, especially in staple unions. Now, for the men, on the other hand, they agreed to use condoms because they wanted to please their partner, or they wanted to protect their partner from HIV if they had multiple relations outside without necessarily telling them. And they also wanted sometimes to protect themselves if they were not sure about their partners. And for some of the men, having other partners was also a reason that they gave for agreeing to use condoms. And then I've also been involved in studies that focus on the role of community health workers, and particularly because success of ARTs in many countries in Africa is hinged upon the army of community health workers, whose work is to ensure that the HIV-infected take their medication as directed by the doctor. Now, currently, I'm involved in my colleagues and I are involved in conducting a study into the acceptability of new pediatric formulations for the management of HIV in infants. And we are interested in understanding the contributions to acceptability and adherence to the use of new pediatric ARV formulation that has been introduced and is under trials. And we are interested in understanding the contextual factors under which initiation of and continued use of this ART may occur. So the key source of our data in our study is the mother-infant dyad, but we are also interested in the healthcare provider, healthcare giver, and infant triad. Our anthropological studies have benefited from collaborations between anthropologists and between anthropologists and experts from other disciplines. Within anthropology, our collaborations have brought together researchers from the Global South to collaborate in research, but also we have worked with those from the Global North. At the Institute of Anthropology, where I'm a faculty member, these have mainly been with researchers from Denmark, from Norway, from North America, and to a lesser extent from Britain and Japan. The question that I want us to, as my final conclusion, basically I would like us to focus on what is the nature of power structures between anthropologists and the other scientists, between anthropology and other disciplines. What's the nature of the relationship? How do we operate? The second issue that maybe I would like us to discuss is how is the power distributed between the Global South and the Global North? And finally, the last issue is an ethical issue. What relations do we cultivate between the anthropologists and the hailing? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Isaac. This was a fantastic presentation. And now I will introduce Sergio Carrara. Sergio will speak from the table, and I'll put your slide if you allow me to. Sergio comes from the State University of Rio de Janeiro, and has also been on the board of the Center for Latin American Studies of Latin American Center of Studies of Sexuality, and he has done very important work on human rights and sexuality. So Sergio will talk about syphilis and Zika in contemporary Brazil. Thank you, Sergio. Use that. I'll put your slide. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
I'd like to thank you, Christiana, for inviting me for this round table and for organizing the round table. Well, for the discussion, I would like to pick up on some of my previous research on the so-called fight against the venereal disease in the early 20th century Brazil. Syphilis was then one of the central concerns of the international scientific communities, as the disease was regarded as not respecting national borders, nor racial or climate differences. Building on this previous experience, I want to address some aspects of the emerging epidemic of Zika, also considered a global threat. For that, I draw on the first anthropological work that I know of about the Zika epidemic in Brazil, the book Zika, do Sertão Nordestino à Ameaça Global. Zika from the northeastern Sertão to the global threat, published by Brazilian, published by Brazilian anthropologist Débora Diniz this year. In my study of syphilis, it was impossible to investigate the Brazilian syphilographers' network in the late 19th and early 20th century without addressing their relationship with their European masters, especially the Germans and the French. For Diniz, it's also impossible to approach northeastern Brazilian researchers on Zika without discussing their relationship with their southern Brazilian colleagues. Taking into account these two cases, syphilis and Zika, I would like to discuss with you some ideas about how science, whether biomedical or anthropological, produced in peripheral social contexts, addresses global disease. I'm particularly interested in one of the most paradoxical consequences of the recognition of the global nature of certain problems, which ends up actually reinforcing different ethnic or national. My work on venereal disease was also a work on nationalism, as expressed by Brazilian scientists. At stake was the recognition by the centers of science in Europe and North America of the very existence of a Brazilian science which developed quite singular theories on syphilis. Basically, I analyzed the symbolic geopolitics of syphilis, showing how Brazilian syphilographers successfully challenged some entrenched ideas about the disease. Essentially, they, one, disputed the idea that there existed a malignant tropical syphilis, proving that, unlike what European physicians postulated, the symptoms of syphilis in the tropics were far milder than in colder climes. Second, they disputed the idea that the origins of the disease lay in the Americas, proving that even if it had been taken from the Caribbean to Europe on Columbus' ships, as the Europeans would have it, syphilis had been introduced to Brazil by the colonizers from Portugal and France. And finally, they, with the help of the anthropologists, they disputed the idea that the country was doomed to forever be an ideal breeding ground for the disease, given the stereotypical attributes of its population sexual excess, supposedly resulted from the tropical climate and the miscegenated racial makeup of the country. For the syphilographers of the first half of the 20th century, excessive sexual behavior was a legacy of the Portuguese and had intensified during the years of slavery. In other words, it was a product of the country's history and culture and not of its climate or race, and could thus be reversed through education. I address the arguments of Brazilian syphilographers as anti-colonial strategies and stressed that paradoxically, through syphilis, a relatively optimistic representation of Brazil, its culture, people, and development potential was built up. In this sense, although syphilis was known to transgress ethnic, national, and racial boundaries, it was also instrumental in restating these very same boundaries. Although I tracked how the dissenting ideas of the Brazilian syphilographers were spread and incorporated into the scientific circles of the global north, it seemed to me that all those anti-colonial strategies were doomed to a relative failure, since they took place within the context of a double-bind relationship with the northern scientists, with whom the Brazilians, they disagreed, but from whom they picked legitimacy. The Brazilian scientists could not accept certain ideas and theories which, formulated by their European colleagues, were based on a supposed Brazilian inferiority. But they, by the same token, Brazilian scientists could not completely subvert them because the source of their local prestige emanated from the north, as it is still the case today. In my research on the science of syphilis, I did not explore what we might call the peripheries of the periphery, which is now what comes to the first rank of analysis around the science of Zika. Diniz offers precisely the information on how the chain of technological and symbolic interdependence that structures the world or the universe of science is not only about global north and global south, but it extends inside national southern contexts, like in Brazil. In this process, other norths and other national regional identities are produced. In Brazil, the political topography of science is inverted, so to speak, insofar as the south of the country actually holds nationally the same dominant position as the north does globally. The Brazilian north and northeast regions are marked, as Diniz puts it, by colonial difference. And Diniz' approach provides privileged access to researchers, physicians, and especially patients living in this poorest part of Brazil. For her, they were the central actors in identifying the presence of the Zika virus in the country and in establishing its alarming and previously unknown impacts on the nervous system. According to the data presented by Diniz, I summarized some of them in the slide. According to this data, 3 relatively independent networks of physicians, researchers, were responsible for detecting the presence of Zika virus in Brazil and for ascertaining its relationship with congenital microcephaly. These networks were made up primarily of physicians and researchers working in the northeastern state capitals, with links to labs situated in the more affluent south and southeast regions. The circles are the networks. 2 networks were involved with identifying the presence of the Zika virus in Brazil. Without access to a laboratory of its own, one of them sent blood samples to 2 federal labs located one in the Amazonian state of Pará and the other one in the southern state of Paraná. The other network had its own lab at the Federal University of Bahia and was able to produce evidence more quickly. It was one of the members of this northeastern group who first announced the presence of the Zika virus in Brazil to the mainstream press in April last year. But the former network was the first to have the results published in an international scientific journal. The researchers from Bahia only managed to publish their findings in an international journal months later, in the form of a letter to the editor of the Emerging Infectious Disease CDC publication. The hypothesis of the causal link between Zika and congenital microcephaly was put forward by a 3rd network involving northeastern physicians, all women, from the states of Paraíba and Pernambuco. It was a physician from Paraíba who, in early November 2015, sent south to a federal lab in Rio de Janeiro samples of amniotic fluid of 2 women who had had Zika during pregnancy and whose fetuses developed microcephaly. By the middle of the month, it was November, the Northeastern researchers could announce the positive test result to the Brazilian mainstream press. An article in an international journal, the Ultrasound Obstetric Gynecology, soon came out in January this year, bearing their names as authors alongside with the names of the 2 researchers from the Rio de Janeiro Federal Lab. The rapid, simultaneously collaborative and competitive dynamic involving the detection of the presence of the Zika virus in Brazil and its terrible consequences for pregnant women sets into play different hierarchies of credibility and can be interpreted in different ways. Diniz particularly explores the conflict that set the scientific centers and elites in the south and southeast of Brazil against those in the northeast. I imagine that she incorporates the way the northeastern researchers interpreted the situation. According to her words, I quote, "There was a degree of skepticism as to the very existence of thinking science in the Northeast. What was striking, she says, was the fact that it was not Rio de Janeiro or São Paulo with the most funding research infrastructures who were announcing to the world that a discovery had been made in Brazil. Ultimately, she presents this Brazilian northeastern way of doing science, as opposed to the Brazilian south and southeast ways, as an example of how peripheries to do science and submit their struggles for recognition, a feature that equally marks the Brazilian way of doing science in relation to the global north. Other interpretations are of course, possible, pointing to other kinds of scientific hierarchies. There is, for instance, the one that tends to be played out between clinical diagnosis and laboratory evidence, in which the latter has higher status than the former when it comes to producing conventional scientific proof and branding the authorship of a medical discovery. This makes of crucial importance having access to cutting-edge laboratories whose distribution across the country and the globe is not uniform. But what is at stake is not just the unequal distribution of resources, but the way this inequality is perceived, including by anthropologists, and how the struggles for their redistribution come about. It's hard to imagine how to combat a threat that does not need a visa to travel from one country to another, using infrastructures that are controlled by nation states. It's even harder to comprehend how a state of affairs marked by inequality could be subverted by a rhetoric that merely by inverting polarities creates, recreates, and reinforces national and regional borders. This rhetoric, as we have seen, is easily harnessed by those who see themselves as part of the global north and tend to maintain a colonial attitude towards the south, while the latter tend to represent themselves as voices from the south without realizing that they are themselves norths in comparisons to peripheries that are still more vulnerable. The network, designated as Brazilian or Northeastern, is just one link in a far wider chain of interdependence. Likewise, the region where it is situated is just one more checkpoint in the trajectory of a virus that, carried by an extraordinary insect, is already widespread in other regions, as happened earlier with syphilis and so many other epidemics. The existence of these checkpoints, where a biological threat is intercepted in its expansionary trajectory, depends on the way symbolic and technological resources are distributed. Inequality of resources translates into the absence of such checkpoints in places where they are most needed, jeopardizing the installation of any global protection mechanisms, if one is to believe, of course, in the efficacy of scientific knowledge, as I do. Perhaps to end, we must at least praise the virus for remembering us that at the end, we are just one humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio. It's my pleasure now to introduce Karin Jensen. Karin comes from Norway and Sweden, but will bring us her research on chikungunya, which is so close to Zika in where it comes from, what it does, and how it's being addressed. So please, Karin has been working on La Réunion. Come in. La Réunion, and will bring a very unexplored case where global health and anthropology get together.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
So it's not on.
Start with the slides right away.
Yes.
Yes.
So, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Christiana, for inviting me to come here today. I'm very grateful to be here. This is my first time at the AAA, and it's quite overwhelming, but it's been so much fun so far. And I'm also very grateful to Christiana for actually having us send the PowerPoint presentations in advance, because my computer died last night. And I'm blaming that, as everything else, on the metaphysical presence of Trump. So there you go. Okay, so as this is a round table, I'm going to give a brief presentation, and I'm not going to delve into sort of the complexities of local conceptualizations of chikungunya, but I will be more than happy to answer any questions, if you have any, regarding that. What I will be talking about, on the other hand, is neglect, in the particular case of how the French public health authorities handled the 2005 to 2007 chikungunya epidemic in La Réunion. So, from March 2005 to April 2007, the Indian Ocean Island and French Overseas Department of Réunion experienced for the first time ever an epidemic of the vector-borne disease of chikungunya. So let's see. So my slides aren't. So my slides seem to be stuck as well. Sorry about that. Yeah, there you go. Oops, again. Okay, great, thank you. So chikungunya is a virus carried by the female Aedes albopictus and Egyptian mosquito, which is the same mosquito that carries Zika, dengue fever, and yellow fever. And chikungunya takes its name from the Makonde language on the border between Tanzania and Mozambique, where the virus was first isolated in 1953. And chikungunya can literally be translated to that which bends up, as the picture is illustrating as well, because it refers to an infected person's characteristically arched back, resulting from symptoms of arthralgia, as the virus attacks the joints and leads to painful swellings and substantially reduced motor functions. And these symptoms may last for a few days only, or in some cases for several years. Other symptoms include fever, headaches, and rash. There is, as of now, no effective vaccine against the virus, but infection results in lifelong immunity. So with 266,000 cases and 250 deaths, chikungunya infected almost 30% of Réunion's total estimated population of 802,000 inhabitants. In comparison, the more recent spreading of chikungunya across the Caribbean and Latin America from December 2013 onwards led to a total of 1,135,000 infected cases and 176 deaths. So it's no doubt that Réunion was severely affected. On such a small island of 802,000 inhabitants, 250 people actually died. So the large numbers in infected cases in Réunion were in part caused by the vector's adaptation to an urban environment, but also, and this is my argument, late and inadequate public health response. And in this brief presentation, which is based on a total of 8 months of fieldwork in Réunion in 2009 and 2010, I will discuss how this gave rise to the general population's mistrust in the public health administration and to the politicization of the epidemic, with the French government on one side and the Réunionnais on the other. Because what's important here is that despite Réunion's geographical location in the Western Indian Ocean, as a French overseas department, Réunion is a fully included part of France. It counts as one of the 101 administrative counties or departments of France, and its citizens are fully French citizens. And similar to my colleagues here, I will make the point that disease cannot be merely investigated as an isolated issue of health, but that it also forms part of local cultural knowledge productions and of global geopolitical concerns. And to follow up on this claim, I will discuss the neglect of chikungunya as it was played out in the ethnographic field in Réunion, and to some extent in global health and in the subject field of epidemiology. To put it plainly, although chikungunya appears to have been extensively counted, it has not, in my opinion, been sufficiently accounted for. So, the 2004 to 2007 chikungunya epidemic began with small outbreaks on Lamu Island. In Kenya, or outside of Kenya, in June 2004. And the disease then spread across the Indian Ocean, to the islands of the Seychelles, the Comoros, and Madagascar before it finally reached Réunion and Mauritius. And chikungunya had never previously been diagnosed in the region. The virus was first detected in Réunion in March 2005 and communicated to the general public by the Regional Department of Health and Social Affairs, or DRAS, 1 month later. DRAS is the governmental agency responsible for carrying out vector control and eradication on the island. So, according to the French Public Health Authority's estimates, the epidemic was assessed to be over by the end of July 2005. DRAS additionally assured the Réunionnais population that the epidemic was closely monitored and that, in any case, chikungunya was benign and thus non-fatal. Obviously, none of these statements proved correct. Instead, the epidemic peaked in the first 2 months of 2006, with the registration of an astounding 45,000 cases in the first week of February. Moreover, severe health complications were reported in several cases. And chikungunya also claimed its first victim when a 10-year-old boy died. And the boy was the first documented casualty due to chikungunya worldwide. So at this stage, the French government finally acknowledged the potential gravity of infection and finally responded to the situation with economic, medical, and preventive assistance. In total, 91 million euros were contributed toward research, sanitary, and financial relief. The government also mobilized 720 locally stationed and mainland French military personnel to conduct so-called demosquitifications, or démoustification, which is the emic term for prophylactic measures such as the spraying of insecticides. And here are some pictures. And these interventions only took place, however, a year after the virus had first been documented in Réunion, and almost 2 years since the epidemic first broke out on Lamu Island. And moreover, this occurred simultaneously as it was discovered that the Aedes mosquito also exists in parts of southern France and could, as such, spread to the mainland, and it actually did, if someone infected traveled from Réunion during the disease's incubation period. The national French newspaper Le Figaro reported, for instance, that, quote, chikungunya, the mosquito is in France, end quote. This featured headline did not distinguish between mainland and overseas France and instead casually excluded Réunion from its political status as a fully integrated part of the Republic. From a Réunionnais viewpoint, or from a local perspective, it was certainly already a well-established fact that the Aedes existed in France. As the article stated, more than 70,000 Réunionnais, that is, French citizens, had been contaminated by chikungunya up to that point. Moreover, despite the lasting threat of subtropical and vector-borne diseases in all 5 of the French overseas departments throughout the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean, it was only now that chikungunya and dengue were included in the national notifiable French disease surveillance system. Obviously, at this stage, tempers were running high in Réunion. The predominant question in the local press at the time was why the impact of chikungunya seemed trivialized, when a similar problem in mainland France would surely have launched a large-scale and immediate intervention. The vice president of Réunion's regional elected assembly, Jocelyne Lauré, commented, for example, that, quote, "We have the feeling that it is more important to protect the chickens than us Réunionnais," end quote. And the remark reflected upon precautions taken in France to avoid the possibility of bird flu, while the very real chikungunya epidemic continued to severely affect an increasing number of people in Réunion. So I don't know if you don't speak French. Basically, this is an Aedes mosquito riding a duck, and it says, well, if I bite you, you will get chikungunya. And then the duck says, well, if you bite me, I will give you the bird flu. So both misinformation regarding the severity of the epidemic and the government's late and lacking intervention led so to a massive local criticism of the French authorities' alleged abandonment and neglect of their overseas citizens. And here I understand neglect as a particular moral and political landscape, which allows for the neglect to occur in the first place. And in my opinion, the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, as discussed by Sharon here, makes, unfortunately, a very good example. At the root of the problem, as I see it, are processes of objection and debasing, which make certain groups of people into the very well familiar others, and in doing so, render them invisible by placing them outside the sphere of moral obligation. And this, in turn, is reinforced by the construction of diseases that mainly affect poor populations in more temperate areas of the world as tropical. A result of tropicalism is thus that disease becomes associated with so-called exotic and primitive places and people, something which, in the end, can contribute toward legitimizing neglect. And despite that chikungunya occurred in a French overseas department, my argument is that this was also the case in Réunion. For example, the French General Director of Health is quoted as explaining that so-called unusual circumstances arose on the island because, quote, "a developing world epidemic established itself in the developed world," end quote. Such views were also reinforced by science communication. In the dust jacket of the popular scientific book, Le Chic, Le Choc, Le Chèque, which is the chikungunya, the shock, and the check, from 2006 by 2 medical doctors, chikungunya is, for example, introduced to its readership as follows. Réunion has painfully reconnected due to the interference of chikungunya with its ancestral tropical and African roots. What is this mysterious virus with a cannibal name which bends the spine and eats at the cartilage and pride? And I'm not joking. This is, yes, citation. So when action against chikungunya was finally mobilized, it seemed, arguably, not to be the end result of local pressures, but rather the full realization of neglect expressed as tropicalism. And to conclude, and to bring the discussion up to a more generalized level, although chikungunya counts among the diverse group of so-called neglected tropical diseases, or NTDs, that is, diseases with characteristics that mainly affect poor populations, it often remains undistinguishable from dengue in policy and media circles. And despite chikungunya's widespread prevalence and capacity to inflict high human costs, as illustrated by the major epidemics in the Indian Ocean and the Americas, there is, to my knowledge, only an imperceptible amount of research on chikungunya based on qualitative methodologies. This discrepancy in applied research methods and focus, that is, on the epidemic, virus, and disease as such, rather than chikungunya's effects and consequences as an illness in people's lives, may, in turn, have significant implications for those affected by the disease. There is thus, in my opinion, no doubt that this is an area in which we, as anthropologists, might contribute to raise awareness about the issue on one hand, and assist in the development of more culture-sensitive and bottom-up approaches to public health interventions on the other. However, I would thus like to take this opportunity to end this brief presentation by inviting the rest of the participants in the roundtable, and perhaps also the audience, to reflect on how we may effectively get our messages across to public health stakeholders on both national and international levels. And this is what has been raised by almost everyone here, I think. So my question is, how can we avoid a situation like this? And this is from the Latin America and Caribbean epidemic. So I'm just using it to illustrate that obviously we are the victims of chikungunya here, and then the vampire is supposed to illustrate the public health stakeholders. So how do we manage not to have them fly away when we try to get our messages about the importance of local knowledge when it comes to developing interventions, public health interventions? So as I've tried to illustrate here today with the case of the 2005 to 2007 chikungunya epidemic in Réunion, local knowledge about epidemics, and not the least recognition thereof, appears to a large degree to still be wanting. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. As if we hadn't talked about colonialism before, you brought us a case where it's still in its full colors. We have plenty of time to discuss. We have microphones that can go to the audience for questions, and we'll go around the table also. You pointed out in different ways how power relations between different disciplines, anthropology, public health, and other sources of knowledge are in our way to bring in something more effective in responses. You also pointed out how the tensions between global north and global south, or as enacted within countries, also are on the way to produce an effective responses to epidemics. And Sharon, in the beginning, for those of you who weren't here yet, also pointed how important it is to acknowledge the role of government agencies, regardless of what the critical stances we take about them. So I would like you to please engage with one another, and why not start with what can we expect in these days when a new administration is taking office, and the promise of more progressive policies is not immediate in the horizon for all of us. So on the one hand, the viruses and the Aedes aegypti are making their way into more bodies and getting into more people, causing more suffering and more devastation, and global health institutions already, when they were under progressive agendas, were very inefficient in producing safe and quick response, what we have ahead. So, Sharon, I'll give the word to you first, and then whoever wants to begin, and I will bring.
Is this working? Yeah. Okay. So this is a challenging question. I think I just spoke to a colleague who spent the last 2 weeks in Washington trying to obtain funding for Zika-related work yesterday. And he says that the general climate in Washington, D.C., among people who are involved in epidemic and humanitarian response is one of total fear. Many people are not sure if they're all going to lose their jobs. During his acceptance speech, President-elect Trump announced that he did intend to commit to continuing funding for public health measures and for public health containment measures. And in the last 24 hours or so, there seems to be a global movement to try to persuade the new president that climate change is real, with a representative, with a delegate from China informing him that no, China did not make up climate change in order to manipulate global trade. And I believe something like between 150 and 300 business leaders pleading with the president to retain and continue emissions cutting policies. So we have a problem where we're not entirely sure if the leader of the free world and the person who controls the purse strings on the largest source of epidemic financing, and also is the directly controls the largest resource for epidemic surveillance in the world, the Centers for Disease Control, and is one of the largest donors to the World Health Organization, whether or not he believes in germ theory, right? We don't know. And I think that that the future for public health interventions itself is very much in crisis. OFDA and much of funding for humanitarian response tends to fall under the leadership of the Department of State. We don't know what kind of a leadership that we're going to have at the Department of State and what their attitudes are going to be towards global engagement or the social sciences. So there's an enormous amount of uncertainty. Unfortunately, I think that most of us would agree that we were probably unaware until last week of the halcyon days of progressivism that we were in fact living under, right? There was much to critique, but I think that we didn't quite realize how many opportunities there were, like the executive order that I highlighted during my talk, to engage politically in order to insert our voices into active actions of coordination. I think that there is an emergent crisis within the discipline and with all social sciences about not just whether or not we're going to stay relevant, but whether or not we're even going to be able to keep our departments and sustain our existence in the coming 4 to 8 years. And I don't think I'm exaggerating about that. I think we've also been missing a growing crisis within our discipline. And I'll just point out, and then I'll conclude my statement, that when I graduated from graduate school in 2009, there was about 230 to 260 jobs listed in the in Anthropology News, and many of those are global jobs, right? Not just domestic. As of this year, the number peaked, I believe, at 128. And that included postdoctoral positions and part-time positions. So in the space of under 7 years, we've lost more than 60% of our employment opportunities. So we are actually confronting our own crisis of institutional reproduction, and it makes us uniquely poorly qualified for engaging with the political challenges that we're going to be confronting on the epidemic and humanitarian response stage.
In the meantime, there's a mic in the room, so if anyone wants to take in any
Actually, we can bring that out there.
there's another one there.
Okay, yeah.
Feel free to raise your hands while we keep going. So Isaac, would you like to intervene at the moment?
Yeah, maybe for me, and particularly from Sharon's presentation, what seems to come out is, you know, a parallel in terms of the lack of engagement or involvement by anthropologists at the onset. We saw this in the case of HIV/AIDS, and we saw it in the case of Ebola. And you know, it's like, you know, we get involved at a fairly, you know, late stage when things are going, you know, off track and people are asking what's really happening. Do we need to go back to the communities? You know, I would like to see a situation where anthropologists get engaged from the very beginning, from, you know, from the onset, so that we are able to bring the kind of specialized knowledge that is required to intervene in some of these situations. That's one. The second one is the issue of political leadership. I don't know whether we need to engage ourselves as anthropologists in terms of, you know, the politics of, you know, funding, or I say this from what we see at the World Council for Anthropological Associations. We are being asked, you know, from, you know, Europe to South America to the US to support, you know, efforts that are meant to engaging with the decision makers to ensure that there is no cut in funding. I mean, we have seen this with, I think, the National Science Foundation. We saw this in Brazil, you know, we've seen this in Australia, in the UK, the European Union, and I think we need to kind of like to engage, you know, the political leadership so that we ensure that there is funding, you know, available for the kinds of activities and the kinds of research that we get engaged in as anthropologists. Yeah, maybe for the time being, and maybe later I may say something, but I just wanted to bring this out so that we may consider them as we discuss.
Sergio, can you go on? At this moment, Zika is in full blown in Brazil, and politics are going in a very uncertain direction. Could you help bring in something from your expectations?
About the
What can we expect now, and what can we anthropologists do, if we can do anything, or even continue to have a role in society? What's the landscape now, social landscape and political, in Brazil, and how does that, what can we expect in the coming days in public health?
Yeah, well, it's my preoccupation, my concern at this point is that how we as anthropologists, we contribute to reification of collectives, cultures, you know, like Brazil against, I don't know, the third world, the first world, or inside Brazil, the northeast and southeast, you know, and how to go beyond this. And I think this, the disease and the epidemics push us to think in different ways. And the problem is that all the time we keep back on national identities, on almost our national identities or regional identities, no? And this is all the time pushing us back. And for me, I think for anthropologists, a huge challenge, because you all think on identities, and the disease pushes us to think differently, in a sense. So my concern in Brazil now is also the reproduction inside Brazil of the same identities, you know, that keep us apart, like Northeast, Southeast, First World, Third World, and so on.
Before passing to Karen, let me just add one thing about Brazil. Having witnessed how not too long ago, say 10, 15 years ago, Brazil was seen as the example of how public health had come together with social scientists, with the government, with medicine laboratories in order to give a response to AIDS that also accounted for human rights and cared for the health of people in need of medication. Are we losing that very fast, or is there a structure in place that we cannot let go? It was the one place where things were quick and fast and resulted, at least for the responses to AIDS, and monitoring many other epidemics, including Zika, which came out very fast compared to what happened to chikungunya in La Réunion.
I think we're losing very fast lots of things in Brazil now. And I don't know, but it seems to me that this cooperation and the idea that the disease is only approachable by social science, by a bunch of sciences and knowledge, are now in crisis in Brazil.
Okay.
It seems that we have a biomedical approach that is, giving us the right way to do things, not the collaborative way of doing.
We have a question from the audience, 2 questions from the audience, and I still want to go back to you, Karen. Carmen, Shandana, put your question, then Shandana's, and okay. Please. Yeah, I think, or maybe it's only.
Is this working? Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Thanks. I just wanted to say, I mean, of course, these are dire times with the Trump triumph and all of that. But I just wanted to say that yesterday I was at a panel where there was actually, a really quite amazing, heartening paper about Cuba and about the fight to keep neonatal deaths down. I mean, to make sure that there are healthy live births and so on. And one of the things that was actually quite staggering is that, being part of the Zika region, they've had altogether 3 cases of microcephaly on the island due to what public health authorities were able to do. And I guess it has to do, so it's not only a matter of resources, it's also a matter of willingness. The person who was reading out that paper was talking about how throughout the special period, they still had, infant mortality kept going down, even through a time that, Cubans were basically barely surviving. So I suppose, even as we look ahead to these very disheartening times, there's still the possibility that, that social scientists and scientists coming together, working in committed ways, things could, that there's still possibilities.
Thank you, Shandana. Carmen, did you have something to?
Okay. Well, thank you for this amazing roundtable, even for those who doesn't work with health and epidemics. It was very interesting. And I thought that the 2 first papers, Sharon and Isaac, were dealing with a similar problematic, and also the 2 last papers. So I'm going to address a question for 2 questions. Well, I agree, Sergio, that we have to have global response. But your paper, and also Karina, shows that we have hierarchical power going on and national response. So what I would like to hear is the difference between this national response. In the case of Isaac and Sharon in Africa, you said there is different post-colonial institutions that are engaged in this. How the UK, US, and France deal with that in Africa? And for you to, well, Karina, you said something very important. France did not communicate the crisis. What happened in Brazil, we know, should be avoided if France had denounced or communicate to the UN, National Union. So why don't we denounce France for that? I mean, it was a global crisis that could be avoided, or at least we could have researched for 5 years before it started in Brazil, but they did not communicate, simply as that. So is that national response to a global crisis that are different and has different hierarchical power and founding that I would like to hear about?
Well, sorry for my voice. I'll try to address you. I think that Sharon points out to a crisis in anthropology, an institutional crisis that can have a very, very broad effect in anthropology and anthropological research. We are undergoing in Brazil a very similar situation, increasingly serious each day, each notice. I've been receiving messages by WhatsApp here that are amazing about some aspects in Brazil. So in this scenario of crisis in anthropological possibilities of work and research in different countries, and of an increasing terms of interdependence, global interdependence, what do you think that we could do without very significant resources and without nation states? What can we do? Can we do something?
Sure.
What?
Sure.
Okay? That is for everybody in the table. It's not only I think that Sharon made me think in terms of anthropology, but I think that we could think more broadly in terms of the exchange between sciences and things like this. What can we do in such a scenario of so much conservative thinking in positions growing everywhere in the global scenario?
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, can we still go to Karen? And then it's come back. Well, it is very important, but she'll finalize with that. Okay? So Karim will respond to the general questions, and then we'll
Sure.
the
Okay.
good message.
Okay.
I guess I will come back to the question from the audience regarding the neglect of France and how it actually had a major impact on how the epidemic spread. So what I mentioned as well was that there were cases in France, and there were also a minor epidemic in Italy, because obviously they have the same type of mosquito, which is endemic to those particular areas. And it's also reason to believe that that is the cause of the epidemic traveling then onwards to the Latin America and the Caribbean. as you could probably detect in my presentation as well, I'm quite upset and angry at how the epidemic was handled by the national authorities. And I don't have an explanation for why this actually occurred. And I would so like, so much, to end this on a positive note, but I'm having difficulties doing that. So I'm just going to leave it at that, and then I'm hoping that Sharon maybe will have some thoughts with regards to the very important contribution made by the last commentator as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Respond to Shandana's challenge.
Of course. Okay.
So to Shandana's question about Cuba, I would say that probably in the last couple of years working in the space of Ebola and epidemic response, I've become more interested in international relations theory. And international relations theory is profoundly aligned with principles of cause and effect. And, sometimes causes and effects are associated with making selective choices about, opportunities gained, opportunities lost, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, as international relations theory often demonstrates, but as the case-based model of anthropology rarely does, the importance of scale is profoundly important for epidemic response. And Cuba is a lovely example of a small country that is managing its own response to a difficult situation very well, but it has little global import because Cuba isn't big enough to matter. And on a global scale, when we're talking especially about pandemic response, right? And I think that that's really important. To Katrine's point, you're looking at a situation in which France, especially probably because of a sovereignty issue about whether or not Réunion constitutes internal affairs, we're looking at a situation in which failure to participate effectively in effective global public health response during emergencies has no structures of accountability. There is no international criminal court for prosecuting the WHO for the deaths, the unnecessary deaths, of over 12,000 people due to Ebola, right? And frankly, with the election of the recent president and political issues that are confronting Europe, we are now moving away from a paradigm of political accountability and not towards one, right? And so to the extent that somebody acts as a vocal advocate for the idea that global institutions like WHO should be accountable for the number of people that they allow to die rests with us, and we need to be having those conversations in different kinds of spaces. I want to speak particularly to the issue raised about the comparison between the nation states. Now, I would say that I am a large expert on the Ebola literature. Like, I know this literature inside and out in a couple of languages, just two, okay? And what I can tell you is after 2 years of lessons learned activities, major financial investments in future planning systems and so on, there has not been one single comparative effort to look at how France, the UK, and the United States managed their engagements in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea differently. Okay? That responsibility falls to us, and we have no resources to do it. And that is why we need to have a permanent, globally funded institutional capacity for retrospective analysis in the aftermath of these kinds of disasters, because nobody wants to do that kind of multi-scalar analysis. Everybody's moved on. I also want to say that with regard to your question about what to do, we need to engage politically in a very different way than what we've been doing. This paradigm that we've been teaching our students about engagement through writing op-eds is nice and all, but it is hugely insufficient. The most effective argument that I've been able to rally with conservative legislators, right, is that in the room that I gathered, which had 35 anthropologists and social scientists, there was a cumulative total of 250 years worth of regional expertise in that region, all that had been acquired within the last 30 years. And in the form of my own person alone, there's probably been well over $500,000 of federal funds that have been invested in my training and through my employment at state institutions and my professional maintenance and in my research that is essentially going to waste. I think that we need to talk in all of these countries about the disuse of social and behavioral sciences, especially anthropology, as a waste, fraud, and abuse issue. It is the neglect of a national resource. And that involves a different kind of political engagement. I can tell you that the AAA majorly, it has a lobbying capacity. It is expected to engage in a lobbying capacity with legislators in Congress. There is supposed to be somebody who's going door to door and advocating for anthropology, and most of the time what we're advocating for is recognizing the importance of anthropology and please don't cut NSF funding, which frankly doesn't impact most of our professional lives. What we need to do is we need to argue for the insertion of anthropology, not just in engagement, not just in collaboration, but in leadership roles across spectrums, in the CDC, in state, in public health, in defense, which plays a major role financially in funding epidemic response because of funding characteristics or restrictions that only allow for the rapid deployment of financial resources from DoD and OFDA, but nowhere else, right? So we need to know where money moves. We need to insert ourselves in positions where we're making decisions about how money and resources are deployed many months before even some of us become aware of those problems. That involves a different kind of political engagement. And I will say, lastly, right, that it is not, I think that our critiques of nationalism and our critiques of colonialism and neocolonialism have blinded us to the fact that by focusing so intensely on those critiques, we've excluded ourselves from the structures that continue to exist, that make major decisions over people's lives, right? And that govern the circulation of scientific and public health knowledge. We need to rethink that. I think that actually, and I know that this is really tendentious, we need to rethink what national service looks like as anthropologists and what national and civic engagement looks like in anthropologists. We can no longer afford to be neutral, external critiques in this current environment.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Isaac, as the co-organizer, to say final words. Thank you, and thank you all.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think for me, I just want to thank the panelists for useful engagement and for the papers that we have presented. I want to thank the audience for making time to come. And our hope is that the engagement we have had today will, initiate a shift in the manner in which we respond to epidemics when they occur, and particularly in terms of engagement as anthropologists, but also engagement at the political level. So I hope that this panel will at least, initiate that thinking and a shift in terms of how we respond to various issues. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Certainly go out of here transformed with profound knowledge. Thank you very much, everybody.